Hey everybody, welcome to Hollista's Brunch. We are back after a late summer, early fall hiatus so that everybody could enjoy the waning days of summer as we transition into autumn. But now we are in the final stretch. People say that the election is in 3 weeks, but actually the election is now. Millions of people have already cast their votes, and grassroots organizations like like the ones that we're featuring today, have been hitting the ground running for months, especially during the COVID pandemic. And so it's really on us as folks that want to make sure that we're doing our damnedest to make sure that we can swing the states that we can swing and get our communities over the finish line, that we show up and we be present, and we make noise and we amplify and we raise and we give as much as we possibly can to these grassroots entities and organizations that are really, really doing the work despite all of the challenges. So when it came time to think about the way that I wanted to approach this brunch, I called upon two of my dear friends from the shout out Google Next Gen community, Ambar and Aqui, who are the co-founders of Neta Collab, which is a digital advocacy and marketing agency that specializes in social activism and specifically around Latinx communities. They've been doing tremendous work over this past year with all of the challenges and trials and tribulations. So without much further ado, I want to bring on Ambar to tell us more about Neta Collab and set us up for our conversation today. So please welcome Ambar to Brunch. Hey girl.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited for this conversation. When we started brainstorming about it a couple of weeks ago, I was like, oh, this is like so much of what's missing and it's going to be so good. So thank you. So excited to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, if you could just tell us a little bit more about yourself and the work of Neta and kind of set us up for the conversation we're going to be having today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I'm Ambar. I'm Mexican American, and I grew up between the U.S. and Mexico. And what I found is like a really easy way of describing my childhood is that when we were in the U.S., we lived in Vermont in a town that had a population of under 500 people. And when we lived in Mexico, a lot of it was spent in Mexico City, which when I was a kid was the biggest city in the world. And I think that's a good like overview of our childhood and how wild it was at times. So I started my business, Neta Collab, almost 2 years ago now with my co-founder, Dakari Ryan, because we realized that there was a need for more culturally relevant marketing in the social justice and advocacy space. So we started Neta. Right now, we're working with a huge variety of clients. Some of them do environmental justice work. Some of them are helping women access abortions. Others are organizations in the tech policy space. Some are advocacy firms. And right now, really for like the past 9 months, and especially the past few months, we've been really focused on work related to the election and getting out the vote. Our work related to the election really varies. Some of it is doing like get out the vote campaign. So that's creating marketing campaigns and creative collateral for that. Other parts of our work are in tracking the opposition. So for us, that means looking at what Republicans are doing and actually paying attention to their campaigns to see if there's anything that we need to be responding to. And also we do a little bit of coordination work. So that means like looking at organizations that are spending and making sure that we're chatting with them to see if there's any audiences and people that aren't being spoken to. Because a lot of times, you know, maybe there's Latinos being spoken to, but it's all in English, and maybe we need more content in Spanish. So we have a lot of conversations about that and making sure that we're helping to fill those gaps if that's necessary. And very exciting, one of the campaigns that have been really focused on for the past few months is called Aquí, Vota, and one of their team members is here with us today. But we are a program to help get out the Latino vote in Arizona specifically, and the program is bilingual. So a lot of our work is in Spanish as well.
That is so awesome. And I think that strategy work is so important to complement the incredible field organizing work that grassroots activists do to be able to have that overlay of the analysis. And even that, like, I'm really intrigued. I'm actually curious, do you have like an example of any like insights you gleaned by looking at Republican advertisements? Because I kind of try to avoid it for my own, like, so I'm curious, like, what you're learning from the other side. Do you have any insights on that side of things?
Yeah, I mean, it's so fascinating. To be honest with you, this is like, it's terrifying, but I also think it's like one of my favorite parts of our work is just seeing what's going on and kind of trying to be strategic about it in that sense. And I would say like one of the key takeaways that we've had is that right now, like all of the data suggests that if people are planning on voting Trump, it's really tough. It's really difficult to persuade them, right? And like we're from what we know that we need to target people that might not vote, but not necessarily, we don't need to be talking too much to people that are already planning on voting for Trump. And so part of our work involves looking at their messaging and their creative to see who they're trying to speak to, right? Because if they're trying to also speak to those people that might not be planning on voting and could potentially lean either way, then we need to be speaking to them about similar issues. But if they're just speaking to their base, then we're able to kind of say like, okay, we don't need to acknowledge that messaging. And a lot of our work specifically right now is about anti-abortion messaging. And this is, I think, one of those things where it's like really interesting. And I think it became such a huge issue in the 2016 election. But because of how difficult this topic is for people to talk about, it usually doesn't happen until the last few weeks before the election. And so just like in 2016, over the past week and couple of weeks, we've been seeing a lot of increase in messaging, like pro-life messaging. And it's just one of those things that it's kind of like, it's like not as spoken about publicly. Neither side is as loud about it until we get this close to the election, and then they start speaking up about it more. So I think that's like one of the key things that I've been really interested in.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I think that's a perfect segue to actually bring on the our guests of the two organizers, as well as a creative musician friend of mine that's also been doing work to engage those folks that, you know, the folks who are going to vote for Trump had voted for Trump, right? And so what we're looking for is how to engage folks that wouldn't otherwise be voting. It's hard to imagine an undecided person in this election, but they exist. So without much further ado, I'm excited to invite on Melissa from Aquí, Vota, Chai from Freedom Action Now in Wisconsin, and AJ Rafael. Welcome to brunch, everybody.
Hi, everyone.
Hey, hey. Awesome. Well, thank you, Ambar, for setting us up. And I'm curious if we can just go around and have everybody introduce themselves. So Melissa, why don't we start with you, just because Ambar has been working with you so closely in collaboration for Aquí Vota. If you could let us know a little bit more about yourself, your background, and how things have, what the work during this election you've been focused on, and also what you're having for brunch.
Of course. Thank you. And thank you so much for having me and Aquí Vota today with you. It's an honor and a pleasure. So the accent, I usually tell people when they ask me where I'm from, I tell them that I'm from here, but the accent is from Venezuela. I'm South American by trade. I was born in Peru, but when I was very little, my mom and I moved to Venezuela. So that's where I grew up. So my Spanish is 100% Venezuelan. And I've lived in many places, so I've been able to see different political systems in places that are different to the US. And in this election, I am the project manager for Aquí Vota. I'm very proud of the work we're doing because we are the first campaign that's designed 100% in Spanish first. So we ideate our content in Spanish, and then we go into the English part of things. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to get Latinos to get engaged in voting, and we're giving it a different angle, talking about everyday life, things that affect them. And those are closely tied to voting and politics that they usually don't like to talk about politics. And what I'm having this morning, I'm having hot chocolate, actually.
Yum. We love hot chocolate. That's delicious, even though it's hot in Arizona. Thank you so much. Awesome. Let's throw it to you, AJ. Can you tell us where you're tuning in from and what you've been up to during this election cycle?
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, let me do brunch first. My lovely girlfriend, Alyssa, made some eggs and these little porky sausages and like a little cute avocado toast. So she's the best. Shout out to her.
Very impressive.
Yes. Hi. Yeah, I am a musician. Mostly have the vehicle for my career has been YouTube since 2006, actually. So it's been 14 years now, or 16 years. Wait, 14 years. Math, musician. I've been doing a lot, I feel like, this last month. It's Filipino American History Month right now. So I've said yes to a lot of things, hosting, performing, sending in virtual performances. And obviously, it's also very close to the election. So I've been trying to engage my platform, which we'll talk about later in what way that I've been doing it with this team called Philams for Biden. But we've been having like a weekly town hall with young like college age Filipino Americans to help them kind of converse with their parents and their family, and how us as Filipino Americans as well, we're still struggling to find our identity right now in America. So yeah, just been doing a lot of events. I'm a little tired, but I'm honored that you asked me to be part of this today, Hollis. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. And yeah, you're rocking your Hate is a Virus shirt. So
Yes.
I just wanted to give a shout out to our Hate is a Virus family, because you were actually co-hosting the fundraiser last night with Suchin Pak.
Yes, 3-hour
Asian American
fundraiser.
pop culture legend, when we really didn't have anybody else out there.
So true.
But you guys raised $15K for Asian American organizations, arts and cultural organizations. So that's really incredible work. So thank you for all the ways that you've been engaging.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. So let's throw it over to Chai in Wisconsin, in Madison, Wisconsin. We were just talking about the weather there, and she said it's a beautiful 39-degree day in Wisconsin. So Chai, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself, your background, your history in organizing, and the work that Freedom Action Now has been doing during this election season?
Yeah, definitely. Hello from Wisconsin. And actually, Freedom Action Now is in Madison, but I am in my home out of Stevens Point, Wisconsin, which is like right smack in the middle of Wisconsin. Right smack in the middle of white Wisconsin, I should say. So my name is Ty. I am an organizer with Freedom Action Now. I actually, I was born in a refugee camp in Thailand and came to the United States at a very young age. It wasn't until recently in 2013 that I was actually able to afford to become a citizen. So I've always been like engaged in like GOTV work, but it wasn't actually until after 2013 that I actually was able to vote for the first time. So, any of these elections are always very exciting and important to me, and always reflecting on that journey of that citizenship doesn't come free to many of us, right? And that right to vote isn't free to many of us. So, some of the work that we've been doing in this election is within the API community in Wisconsin, or I guess in the Hmong community throughout the nation, there's a lot of misinformation out there. And so we've really been trying to make sure that our people get the most accurate information about the different campaigns, and really talking about the issues that matter to us, and how voting in this presidential election is actually going to affect those issues. And actually how, as refugees, like we've actually been a lot of things we're hearing is like they don't want to be political, but we've been political since the day we were refugees, right? So really just working in our communities, doing a lot of that GOTV work and getting messaging out, for brunch. And it's in Wisconsin, so now we're ready like after lunch, but Gatorade's been life lately. So making sure that I stay hydrated for this work coming up.
I love it. You are an electrolyte queen. That is incredible. Well, thank you for sharing that. And I love what you just said. First of all, like how elections are deeply personal for you as somebody from a refugee background who didn't have the privilege that myself, for example, like being born an American citizen that we completely take for granted, right? But secondly, what you said about the notion of like refugees or like immigrant communities, like being forcibly politicized from birth. And to me, and we can get into this a little later, but like, I do feel like that's a reaction amongst immigrant communities because immigrants in the United States have been inherently politicized. There's almost this kind of like desire to overcompensate for that and pull away from politics of the now or electoral politics where it counts. When really it's like really time for us all to engage and be heard, because our elected officials need to be accountable to us as much as any or rather be accountable to first generation Americans as much as they would be to folks that are born here. So thank you for sharing that perspective. So yeah, I just want to, for everybody that's tuning in, first of all, thank you so much for spending your Sunday with us and with these amazing organizers and creatives. As you can see, drawing down on the bottom of the screen, we have donation information, and I'm very excited to announce that we actually have already raised a cool $640 so far. We had a $500 donation that was a pass-through for my friend George Watsky. So thank you so much, George, for your donation. And then we also actually had Alyssa Navarro, who I believe is our beneficiary of AJ's breakfast as well.
Yes, breakfast and a donation.
Shawnee Avery. So thank you, the three of you so much, or the four of you so much for your donations. And please, if you're tuning in now, tap a friend, send the link over to a friend, or send the information and give to these incredible organizers that are really doing the work to bring out folks that wouldn't otherwise be voting, to make sure that we have the best shot possible to turn these states blue. Yes. So to that end, I'm curious if we can focus on the work of Freedom Action Now and Aquí Vota. And maybe Melissa, you could start this off. And I'm curious, because what each of you do in your communities is you really focus in because you know your communities better than other organizations, right? So even though a lot of national parties think that they know how to message to immigrant voters, so frequently they don't. So I'm curious if you could just tell us some more about who your community is and some insights that we might not from the outside really understand or know about the folks that you work with.
So I think the first misconception that we have from candidates and campaigns is that Latinos are one block, and we are very, very diverse within our communities. So it's not just one group of people; it's many different groups of people that we have. And then for Aquí Vota, specifically, what we want to do is we want to reach out to the community through organizing that is going to be organically done. We are talking to people so they can do the relational organizing with their friends and their coworkers and their family members. And it is, in Arizona at least, it's been researched that women are more engaged in politics than men. So we're trying to reach out to women who will in turn reach out to their circles. So that's what we're doing differently. We're approaching people first and foremost in Spanish. Many of the Latinos we're talking to are bilingual, but many of those are not. Actually, they only speak Spanish. And some who are bilingual actually prefer to speak in Spanish, and they don't have that habit of talking about politics. And nobody comes with direct messages and talking points and breaks down things in their language. So that's one thing we're trying to do differently as well.
That's excellent. Thank you for sharing that. And just really, understanding, first of all, who is more engaged in targeting them, and second of all, knowing what language they feel most comfortable and empowered speaking about in politics, I think is so important. Cool. Chad, I'm curious if you could answer that question as well for your community in Wisconsin, yourself in the middle of a very white state. But if you could talk to us more about the communities that Freedom Action Now targets. You guys are the only API C4 political organization in all of Wisconsin. And that's a pretty tall order. So I'm curious if you could tell us more about kind of who you target, how you target, and what misconceptions might be there that we wouldn't otherwise know if we weren't in your community.
Yeah, thank you. So, Freedom Action Now is actually a Black Southeast Asian organization. So not only do we do work in the API community, we also do work within the Black community, and building that solidarity, understanding that we're in Wisconsin, any work we do, we actually have to do together, right? I think what a lot of folks don't know about Wisconsin is when we talk about APIs in Wisconsin, we are probably talking about the biggest population of APIs in Wisconsin, which are the Hmong. Hmong folks here in Wisconsin make up more than 36% of the APIs in Wisconsin. And Asian Americans only make up about 2.3% of the Wisconsin population. So to be the largest group of APIs in Wisconsin. But unlike other states, the people here are really spread out. We don't have a large concentration of Hmong or APIs just in one area. Our people are really spread out throughout the state. So any work that we do, we're actually doing statewide work. And so I think it makes it easy for me because I'm right in the middle of Wisconsin. So I'm like within 2 hours of many of the Hmong or Asian American communities. It makes it a lot easier for travel. But I think like along with that though, a lot of times some of the groups that the Asian American groups that we actually work with are the Hmong and Khmer communities or the Hmong and Cambodian communities. And oftentimes, even when we're just talking about Asian Americans, we're the communities that are really excluded or invisible in that Asian American story. And so a lot of our work, especially being the only, not only the only Southeast Asian C4, but the only Asian American C4 organization in the state, really uplifting our stories in that Asian American story, and making sure that our folks are reached in this election in many different ways. As far as language, but also making sure that our issues that matter to our community are elevated and that candidates hear that.
That's so awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. And that is really remarkable. I mean, the fact that the Hmong community, like that ethnic identity and the story of Hmong Americans is so invisibilized within the larger Asian American narrative, right? And I think that like a lot of what we as like East Asian folks, like of Chinese heritage or Japanese or Korean heritage, a lot of what we have to recognize is that so often our voices and our stories and our narratives are centered, and folks like Hmong and Khmer stories that are actually like very significant communities within, especially the Midwest, are completely pushed to the side and misunderstood and completely forgotten about. And I think it's also relevant, you know, like you live in a sparsely populated state where, as you say, like the communities are disparate, you know, and it's not like you just go to one neighborhood and you're able to hit everybody. And so that really transitions into my second question about how the tactics have shifted up during COVID. You know, it's not as simple as going and knocking on somebody's door and wanting to have a 5-minute conversation with them. There's a lot more complications now, and especially with communities that were already shut off. And we can have a whole other conversation about the overlay of the digital divide and how, you know, tech is inaccessible and unreachable for many immigrant and refugee communities. But I'm curious for each of you, obviously you've had to pivot and shift and adapt in the face of a global pandemic and the most consequential election in our lifetimes. So I'm curious for both Melissa and Chai, if you could kind of talk about what your strategies have been to deal with COVID in the midst of outreaching to your communities.
Sure, thank you. So we started this idea earlier this year, and we wanted to do a festival with music and food for the communities. We wanted to do a few through the year heading into the election. We had one planned for April, and then March happened and we had to completely shift from those plans. And we went straight virtual. We created a platform that works with having coaches in different regions of the state. We have 10 coaches, and what they do is they communicate, they get the volunteers, they get voters, they answer their questions, they involve them and their families. So we went from one, let's do parties and get everybody excited about voting, to let's talk to people and have them talk to their families. So we had to shift fairly quickly from March into April, and then started building something different during the summer and adapting to the new reality. One of the things that we're very excited to do too is that we're also doing live Facebook live shows. Most of our audience is on Facebook. So we were doing Facebook live shows where they're completely 100% Spanish. And in those shows, we also talk about the issues and the things that we hear when we have interactions with them. So there's a lot of misinformation. So we try to tackle those things as well, and giving them facts and debunking myths and having them think about politics in a way that is not just the president running for election and I don't like either one of them, so I don't vote. Trying to veer them from that way of thinking into there's so much more involved in voting.
That's totally fair. And is there one case in Arizona one like race in Arizona that's outside of the presidential election or any of the federal elections that you are kind of like using to pivot voters to understand that it's not just about Trump versus Biden, it's actually about like our whole communities being represented?
So we tell everybody that it's from the president to choosing who picks what your kid has for lunch in school. You know, we have school boards, we have state officials that are going to decide what to do with our tax money. So that is very important. Specifically in Arizona, we have the Senate race is very important because we had our Senate race back in 2018, and what happened is between 2018 and 2020, we had John McCain pass away, and for Arizona, the governor actually appoints the replacement of a senator who dies in office. So right now, that specific race is very, very important because whoever wins that race is going to be activated right away and sent to Washington, D.C. and might be voting on the nomination of the justice of the court.
Wow, that is highly consequential. Thank you for breaking that down. It's so important. Obviously, like we need the electoral votes, and we could problematize the electoral college all day. But at the end of the day, it's about making sure that communities are being represented fairly, and making sure that it's not just appointments that are deciding the most important stuff at the top. So Chai, I'm curious for you. I know that we chatted a little bit about the interventions y'all have been taking, especially for communities that are harder to reach and not as aggregated or not as centralized. Could you tell us a little bit more about how your work has been adapting to face the pandemic?
Yeah, I think Freedom Action Now is very new. And so this is our first election that we're engaging in. But our our C3 sister, Freedom Inc., has been doing work for so long. And so we've really been partnering with our C3 organization on a lot of the stuff they're doing. And, I think some of the things that have really switched has been like we've actually gone digital, and this is going digital on everything is very new for our communities, and especially for a lot of the base that we work with, our elders and those who aren't tech savvy. So it's been a lot of like being at going door to door and teaching folks how to use Zoom, how to access Facebook, so that they can join in when we're doing a lot of our virtual education sessions and all of that. Also, the other thing is we've been really strategic on how we're engaging our community and understanding that we actually work with some of the most vulnerable communities, and their safety during this pandemic comes first. And so thinking about what we're doing in order to take care and make sure that our communities are safe, so that we can even have conversations with them around the election. As you all can see, or have been seeing in the news, it seems like Wisconsin has been in this crazy chow, especially around like COVID and everything, and our COVID numbers really rising. And so in this election too, as I'm hearing Melissa speak, for us too in Wisconsin, this is more than just Biden and Harris. This is about holding our elected officials accountable, especially those who put our lives at risk in the spring election, who went against everything our governor tried to do to keep our communities safe, and still forced our people to stand in line for many hours just so they could exercise their right to vote. And so really bringing all of that back up, and so it's really been having a lot of one-on-one conversations on the phones with our folks, but really teaching our folks how to go digital so that they can engage with us on Facebook and YouTube and all the other platforms that they're getting misinformation from as well.
Unmute. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think that's really real. I mean, not only the fact that you are onboarding your community onto Zoom, and I know you said, I just still have this visual in my head that you're talking about. You're like asking folks to leave their phones outside of their door, and they close the door, and then you guys pick it up, install Zoom on the phone, leave it, and be like, okay, tune in to Zoom. Like that's the real that's
Wow.
what door-to-door outreach is looking like right now, is installing Zoom on folks' phones. But I also think what you're saying is real. It's like, we have been so let down by elected officials throughout this entire COVID pandemic. And I think because a lot of us knowing what we know about politics, we are disappointed but not surprised. But the impact of it is no less critical and no less deadly. And I think what you're saying, especially with, it's at the end of the day, it's really a bottom line and an issue of public health, who's in office and who's making decisions and who's putting people's lives at risk. So thank you for sharing that. And I just wanted to give a quick fundraising update. We've actually just broken through $700. Want to thank Daiquiri, Annie, and Sarah. So we're actually up at $760 right now. Would love to round it out to $1,000. So if you haven't given yet, please hit me below either on Venmo or on PayPal, or you can Cash App me if that's your vibe. $ Hollis Wongware. Hit a friend and let them know that we're doing fundraising for incredible, savvy, grassroots immigrant and first generation voter outreach. And let folks know that this is the best and most effective way to give. I think a lot of people want to give to the big dogs, but to us, we really know that it's effective when we give money directly to the folks who are most on the ground with our communities, to make sure that we can make a difference. So Ambar and AJ, I'd love to turn to y'all, because each of you in your ways have been using your millennial digital savvy to get folks out and engage people. So AJ, I'm curious if you could start off, and then we'll go to Ambar. But what we're doing now during COVID, how we're getting people together. I think normally you would be out there performing live on stages at festivals, trying to get folks to the polls and get them registered and get them to vote. So I'm curious what things have been looking like for you and what you've learned through the work that you've been doing.
Yeah, so I did just look on my Instagram memories. 4 years ago, there was a Rock the Vote event with a lot of the Asian American community out here, like the cast of Fresh Off the Boat and things like that. We were all on stage rallying together. I remember us being pretty hopeful about that election. But since we don't have the real stage right now and are not able to play to, a couple hundred people in a concert venue. I've been turning to Zoom, and me and Hollis did talk about this a little earlier before the show, how we might be kind of zoomed out a little bit. There's some Zoom fatigue going on. And I found even in some performances that I turn in, I'm like, did I smile enough for this thing, because this is just the reality. Anyway, I've been listening a lot to everything that Melissa and Chai has been saying, and the town halls that I've been putting on every week through Zoom, we've been reaching out to Filipino American college students, and we want to find ways for them to talk to their parents, and everything they said about communication and talking about the issues that might be important to them is something that, this is a sidebar, by the way, that I'm going to take into my own town halls. We have 2 left until the election. So we've been using that platform. Also, the last one is going to be also on Facebook Live. So yeah, we've been kind of using different resources like OBS, and StreamYard, like this one. These are all free of charge that people can use to go live on their platform, and do transitions, bring on guests similar to this one. This is all stuff you can learn on YouTube. So I've been encouraging people to do that more. Specifically, I've been working with a lot of theater companies because I've been a part of their productions, doing music directing or even as an actor in it. And they've been trying to transition to digital. So me just kind of helping them with OBS for their events and things like that. It has been a little tiring, but it's always fulfilling when you see someone figure out what to do digitally and how to use their platform, and then they can just use that template for all of their events. So it hasn't been a huge pivot for me since I've been doing digital broadcasting for a long time. And also I love games, and I used to game on Twitch and do these streams, but now using it for to inspire people to engage civically has been really fulfilling.
That's awesome. And I think that's so true. It's crazy how the niche skill sets, right? The gamers,
right,
or the YouTubers like yourself, you've been YouTubing for over a decade and building an audience there. And all of a sudden that is prime time.
Right. And that's the skill to have. It's so crazy. And it's really cool that gamers can teach us something.
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No.
But I think that like that's exactly what we need now is just like being able to have folks like yourself where you're like, oh, I've been online, like I've been broadcasting, I've been live streaming. How can we use this and amplify causes that are really like folks like Chai and like Melissa who have been on the ground like doing this work? Like how can we actually partner together and make sure that those skill sets are getting transferred right to the communities that need it most? Because we know that our immigrant communities, our first generation folks in our communities, are the refugee folks, the immigrant folks in our communities are going to get cut out just due to the way that technology adapts to really serve the status quo and isn't particularly inclusive. So Ambar, I'm curious if you can jump off of that, because obviously you're a digital strategist, and so you've been in the influencer social media game for a minute. So I'm curious what it's been like to kind of take those best practices that, you know, we usually think about, like amplifying, you know, brands or just whatever on the social media world, and thinking about how we're utilizing those best practices for civic engagement.
Yeah, for sure. So I connect with a lot of what AJ was just saying, but I think it's really interesting because I've been doing digital marketing for a long time, but this is also the first year that we're doing digital marketing without also working with organizers and people on the ground. And so I think just kind of like reflecting on this, one of the things that has been a lot of trial and error is that digital marketing, there are certain audiences that typically we can speak to a lot easier than others. And right now, without being able to have people going to doors and talking to people in person, there is audiences that are more difficult to reach on digital that we've been having to figure out how to communicate with. And so there has actually been a lot of learning there and a lot of figuring out like different processes to talk to those type of people. And then also just kind of like connecting with our audience where they're at, right? Like Melissa was saying for Aquí, a lot of our audience is on Facebook. And actually a lot of our audience on Facebook that we're supporting and voting is actually older. And so they're not the audience that we would typically have been doing like social media marketing towards, and now we are. And so there's a lot of learning there when it comes to figuring out how we can communicate with them in a way that they trust us and that they want to share what they're doing. So especially with Get Out the Vote and like figuring out what processes we need to put together so that they are able to communicate with us. One of the things that we've noticed just knowing from the Latino community is that there's a lot of distrust. And so them sharing their personal information with us takes a lot more steps. And so one of the things that we've seen is that people just have a lot of questions about voting, and especially in a state like Arizona, where there's so many Latino immigrants that, like Melissa was saying, primarily speak Spanish. A lot of them come and this is maybe their first time voting in an election in the US, and they might come from other countries where the voting system is different. And so a lot of the support that they need is actually very simple questions, but they need support in Spanish. And so a lot of what we've been doing has been like figuring out how to talk to them, figuring out how we need to talk to them so that they trust us, and then being able to answer those questions in the simplest way possible, rather than going through a lot of complex systems that originally, when it comes to social media marketing and trying to build leads digitally, we might have had in place that now we kind of need to remove and just be like, okay, we can help you just from the get-go, instead of having those like barriers in place that wouldn't allow us to get to these audiences that we need.
Yeah, that's really real. I think like the social media platforms, it's so interesting because like they're so volatile and they're so difficult to navigate in so many ways. And so it's, you know, kind of ironic, right? That it's like Facebook being effective for like the older generation, but folks like that are our age are so off of Facebook, especially when it comes to like any sort of information about electoral politics, because we saw how contorted and distrustful the information was in 2016 when Facebook just let a lot of misinformation run rampant and run wild. So yeah, I'm curious, like, I mean, this question's kind of open to anybody, but I think that this generational conversation is really important, right? Like, how are we both like touching like the younger generation, because we know young voters are going to be the decision makers in this election. And if we can get young folks out to the polls is so important. We also have the older folks in our community that have, you know, that double adaptation of having to adapt to digital outright and then adapt to digital during COVID. So it's kind of like this pressure cooker. And I'm curious for each of you, like how you've seen this kind of cross-generation dialogue emerge. Does it feel really divided? Does it feel like folks are coming together? Or like, what are ways, I guess I get just curious for my own, right? Like, how are ways those of us who are like, I guess I'm kind of in the middle, but like those of us who are in the younger generation, like how are ways that we can really like tactically plug in? Like, what are the most effective ways for us to be plugging in our kind of like native digital understanding to making sure that we are resourcing our whole community, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think this is kind of like sideways from that, but one of the things that has just been like on my mind so much for the past few months and just really related to this, like, yes, in different generations, but also even just if we're creating content that's shareable, that's great, right? But still, my major question is still like, how are we reaching outside of our bubbles? And if these people that, even if the content gets shared 100 or 1,000 or whatever amount of times, how are we still making sure that we're creating content that is still interesting to somebody that might not be in the same mindset that we are? And how are we able to engage those people that aren't just like, yes, everybody should vote, like, let's do it, we know why we're voting, we know all these things, because there's so many people that just don't connect with that type of content because they're not there. And so I think that has been, regardless of which generation it is, I do think it's a lot of it is older generations, but I do think we've actually seen that, especially in the Latino community and younger generations, especially generations that are more recent immigrants as well. And so I do think that there's that's like kind of been like my major question is like, how do we create content that people that don't already agree with us are going to share and get interested in too?
Yes, I feel like, oh, I'm so sorry. Chai, please.
No, you go ahead. You go first.
I just had a thought because I just watched Social Dilemma, and it's a Netflix documentary on just how, you know, the more you lean towards a certain side, the more these articles will show up on your newsfeed. So everyone's is kind of like Ambar was saying, it's put in a way where we feel comfortable, you know? So it does sometimes feel like I'm preaching to the choir when I'm put out the vote things. So yeah, that is a challenge to see how we can make content that is sort of universal. And like, I always am wanting to speak out like hard to the left and say why all these things, but I have found that people engage more with the stuff that is a little more neutral, you know, and then finding ways to kind of plug in and give little hints like, hey, this is really what I believe in. So, I mean, I think the answer to the question is that it's hard to, we're all still figuring it out. And, you know, when I'm on TikTok, especially, I see this algorithm working where you watch one video for the whole 60 seconds, then you get like multiple videos coming in after on the explore page, on the For You page, that are similar things. You know, I've seen the younger audience on TikTok really mobilize as well. They are really aware of all the issues. I mean, Claudia Conway, Kellyanne's daughter, is on TikTok. She has a large audience and she speaks out against her mom's administration, you know, rightfully so. But yeah, it's the algorithm is all kind of crazy. So I'm totally with you, Ambar.
And I think for what we're doing in Arizona is we're trying to get people to talk to their relatives. So where there's a millennial, there's a Gen X, you know, and there's a boomer. It's a family, because when we talk about Latinos, there's a lot of family still. And even though we don't have those Sunday meals anymore because of COVID, I think there's a lot of interaction between the different generations within a family. So I think it's important to get one of the three generations interested in talking about what's happening in the election and making politics, making the election a suitable word for reaching out to your friends and relatives and not a dirty word anymore. I think that's one of the things that we're trying to do. We're trying to talk to certain people so they talk to those other generations and they have the material in that language so they can reach easier.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. I was just gonna say that, like, for many Asian American families or Hmong and Southeast Asian families, we live in multi-generational households, and so I think the messaging that we've been sending young folks is very important, not just to engage themselves, but to engage beyond themselves, right? And to think beyond. I want to say this American way of thinking of just ourselves, but to bring that traditional family centered thinking back in and saying, once you've done your ballot, now it has your grandparents, and engaging them in making sure that their parents and their grandparents' absentee ballots are also filled out. Also, like, we're learning to build this in as a way, and we're doing it in our practices here. And a lot of the partners that we work with is teaching them how to build checking on folks' political state as a part of checking on their wellness. So while this pandemic, while we're checking to make sure folks are okay, we also should be checking and saying, do you have all the support you need to make sure that your ballot is filled out? Do you have all the support you need to make sure that you understand what's on your ballot as well? And so I think that messaging and that different way of like mobilizing our community needs to come about.
Yeah, that's amazing. I just put that in the chat too, but I think that's so true. It's like our civic health is part of our holistic health. And I think this COVID crisis has demonstrated for all of us that, you know, we cannot take our health for granted. We need to be sensitive and conscientious of people's needs. And I think that's why it's been so enraging for those of us who have been seeing this whole, like, the idea of wearing a mask as inhibiting somebody's individualism or freedom of movement is just the most, like, deeply self-sabotaging American concept ever, because I think for all of us, we all come from communities where we've had to be deeply conscientious of those around us. And, you know, whether that's kind of like, I know from my perspective as a Chinese American, just like having veterans for your elders and, you know, just being really sensitive to their health and their needs and putting that really before your own, because you understand that the health of your elders is really the health of us all. A lot of people didn't grow up culturally with those values, and we're seeing that conflict in real time. But I think that's something I'll definitely take away from this conversation, that notion of really centering like your civic health. Like your civic wellness is part of it, because that's actually what's going to be the legacy of how our public health is going to be determined. So I think that's really important. And I also really like what you were saying, AJ, in terms of like, you know, just being thoughtful about, well, actually everybody was kind of saying this and it resonated, but just the idea of really being thoughtful about, like, there's the things that we want to say and we want to fly off and pop off and say all the stuff that we want to say. And then there's like, okay, how can I kind of put my personal pride and my personal opinions over here, and I can journal about them, or I can text about them in a group text. But how can I actually think about creating things that really invite open conversations and invite people in? And so I'm curious, like, I don't know if there's any messaging for any of you that you feel has really been working to kind of have those conversations that wouldn't otherwise be had, when we kind of shirk away the, like, we feel this way and they feel another way, and kind of inviting in the folks that are existing in that liminal space.
Yes, I'd love to hear some tips on that, please.
Yeah, I mean, I really think that, like, one of the things that we've been seeing is that people also want to be heard. And so that's one of the things that we've been kind of trying to move over to, is to figure out how to not only be sharing our voices and talking about the issues that we know matter to our communities, but also to allow people the chance to speak as well. And so that's actually when we've seen, at least in like digital ads that we've been running, that we get some of the best engagement is when we actually ask a question, instead of us like just putting out there how we feel. And I think that is a really good starting point, because honestly, we're all learning which type of content is relevant to these audiences, and allowing them the chance to tell us instead of us just like assuming that we know how to speak to them, I think it's a really good starting place.
Yes, that, but I think like the other thing, like we've also been thinking and we've been doing as well, is what we're seeing in our community right now is that a lot of folks who actually want to vote for Trump, they're doing that because of their anti-blackness. And so there's a part about asking the questions, but for us as well, like we actually have to point out to people, why is it that they actually want to ignore the issues of Asian Americans and vote against our communities? And that really is pointing out that a lot of the reasons why they want to vote against our communities is because of their anti-blackness. They want to vote against everything that's happened this summer during the uprising. So yeah, asking the questions, but still being very upfront with our community and honest with our community.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really profound point. And I think that's something I would love to hear Ambar and Melissa, maybe y'all speak to. Because as Chad was mentioning, like, and this is something that I learned when I was having a conversation with Chai when we were introduced over the phone a couple of days ago, but that there's actually been like a lot of anti-Hmong and anti-Khmer violence in Wisconsin, like that the Asian American community has been really victimized and traumatized by racism. However, there is this undercurrent of anti-blackness within Asian American immigrant communities. And obviously we don't have all the time in the world to break down why these communities have been pitted against each other and understand themselves as oppositional. But, like anti-blackness is very real, and Trump runs on a platform of, frankly, white supremacy and anti-blackness that's laden within it, and it trickles down into national and state and local representatives. And that's a very real element that we need to call out and not just pretend like it doesn't exist. And clearly with Freedom Action Now, like y'all are working in partnership, like one of your target communities is the Black community. And so there's clear intentionality behind that. I'm curious if y'all have encountered that for Aquí se Vota, if that is a conversation that y'all have in your communities and how you navigate that. Oh, Melissa, I'm gonna unmute you.
For the Hispanic community in Arizona, it's a generational thing. We find that the younger generations don't really have those holdups, but the older generations still do. So that anti-blackness is still felt in the boomers, and I don't know so much the Gen Xers, but mostly in the boomers. And it's a thing that's being rooted in a lot of historic things in the state. But it is something that we also see a lot of families, because there's different generations, right? Trying to have those conversations, and the younger generations trying to get to the point where there is acceptance and there is a realization that those things are happening and why they're happening and why we should be supportive of other minorities as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the really scary things that we've seen a lot in the Latino community is just how fast disinformation spreads on Facebook, especially, but also on all platforms. And I think that's been like one of the major concerns that we've had doing this work, especially because so much of it is centered around anti-Blackness. But even more than that, the information that's being put out there about Black Lives Matter, about the protests, and like trying to create this language around it being violent and trying to speak about it in these ways, like actually has been shared a lot. And that's something that's really concerning, because if there's already anti-Blackness in the community, and then there's this content being put out there and just being seen and seen and seen, it just starts to be, it starts to look like facts for this community. And that's really scary. But that's, I think, like the major thing has been like thinking about how we're, like Melissa was saying earlier, one of the things with Aquí se Vota that they've been doing is like these live conversations to kind of like debunk things that are happening. And that's just one of those spaces where we need to be able to speak about the information that's being spread and know how to then say when something is inaccurate. And I think a lot of what's happening right now, especially when it comes to voters that might be voting for Trump because of that, and because they don't believe in these certain things that are happening, a lot of it is false. And so it's really scary, but definitely something that needs to be worked on, like in our communication, whether it's like in the families themselves and like figuring out how to tell people how to have those conversations, but also in the content that we're putting out there and the conversations that we're having as well.
Yeah, that is so important, and I appreciate that. I think that's so real, is that when these messages are inundated on social media or however, they begin to look like fact when we know them not to be fact. They are actually like very distorted and terrible lies. And again, I think like just for our own self-preservation, we've been very normalized. So like, oh yes, like there's tons about anti-Blackness. Oh yes, like there's tons of racism. Oh yes, white supremacy is firmly within the White House, and Stephen Miller is like literally a Nazi and is like writing all of our policies. It's like we know too much. So, but the counter messaging, and it sucks that it even has to be counter messaging. The fact that we're saying like anti-Blackness is wrong. Black Americans are not the reason why our communities are maligned and marginalized and misserved. Like, it's so basic, but at the same time, it's so critical, because these assumptions, if they're allowed to go unchecked, are so dangerous. So very clearly dangerous and irresponsible to have within our communities. Have you experienced that, AJ, in your outreach work? Has like anti-Blackness within the Filipino community been a conversation that you've encountered?
Yeah, it has actually. There's a rapper named Ruby Ibarra, and she's an amazing Filipino American rapper. And I had a show with her in February, right before COVID. And she just straight up said, and it was in Arizona too. So she was just like, this is in between her songs. She's like, Filipinos, we need to face the colorism that is happening within our community. We need to get rid of the whitening soap ads. We need to get rid. She's, calling out all these things. She's like, colorism leads to anti-blackness, and anti-blackness leads to racism. And that's about as plain as I could put it. And I could see people in the audience they're young people too. I feel like when it's laid out like that, it's like, wow, that makes sense. We've been, conditioned all our life to not go outside not because we're going to get sunburned, but because we're going to get darker. My grandma used to tell me that all the time. And I know that a lot of people in our community and my families and stuff, it comes from colorism, and I feel like when I had posted about it on my Instagram, I wrote this long thing, about how, the colorism that's happening within the Filipino American community and the Filipino community is rooted really deeply. And we had some pushback as well from some of my Filipino friends. And, the more I was clicking on their profiles, the ones who were kind of pushing back against what I was saying about colorism and anti-blackness leading to racism, then finding that these people, had posted more about right-leaning things, so it's like that mindset that we're all kind of talking about it, and the fact that they are probably voting Republican or for Trump does root from anti-blackness, because white supremacy doesn't have to be exclusively for white people, it happens within our communities as well. So to answer your question, it is a conversation, and I think really when it's plainly just put out there like that, then people are able to confront that. And even within myself, the little comments and jokes that I've made growing up about being dark and being too dark and things like that were things that I had to really internalize to unlearn.
That's a profound point, and I think it's definitely resonating with a couple of the folks that are tuning in today. So we are winding down our program. It's been such a delight to hear from each of you, and just so thankful for the work that y'all are each doing in your states to engage folks that wouldn't otherwise be engaged. Chai, you are really fighting a good fight in Wisconsin in a big, wide state, and you're in the middle of it, and you are doing that outreach at home. And I'm walking away really inspired by the work of Aquí, Vota to be, figuring out how y'all were planning on doing outdoor festivals and engaging community IRL. And so to figure out how to pivot that and provide programming in Spanish so that folks can really feel confident in having the conversations and realizing why it connects so deeply. Our democracy is on the line in a big way, but also our public health is certainly on the line. And it sounds like, especially in Arizona and Wisconsin, like these are incredibly consequential elections to make sure that the state governance and the local governance is really being accountable to our immigrant communities and our most vulnerable communities. So we're going to have AJ close us out with a performance. But before we do, finally, just thank you so much for everybody that's been tuning in. It's been great to read your comments. And if you haven't given yet, please do Venmo me or PayPal me. We are at $800, which is really, really exciting. And we're so thankful for everybody that's given. And it's going to be equally split between Aquí Vota and Freedom Action Now. Please give if you haven't. You can give again if you've given. And please hit a couple friends and encourage them to give as well, because this work is deeply, deeply important. But yeah, I'd love for Ambar and Melissa and Chai, any last thoughts that you'd like to share with our audience before AJ closes us out?
I just want to say that the working Arizona is just starting.
Go ahead, Melissa. Go ahead.
Sorry. No, it's just starting, and this thing we're doing, we don't want it to end. We don't want to retake it every time there's an election season, and I think that talking to the Hispanic community straight about elections is something that we need to continue doing as a regular thing.
I love that. Thank you so much. And the kind of what Chai was talking about, it's like your civic health is your holistic health. It's like you can't just get a checkup once every 4 years or once every 2 years. It's like you got to check up on it regularly. That's super real. Chai?
Yeah. I think I just want to leave everybody with this is only the beginning. We actually still need to prepare and protect our community, regardless of whatever happens after November 3rd. And we know that no matter who wins after November 3rd, our communities, their safety will still be at risk, and we still have to protect our communities so the work doesn't end.
Yeah. I love that. I love that this is like, obviously this is a critical moment, but this is really just the beginning for both of y'all's organizations doing the grassroots work to make sure that our communities are safe. Thank you. Ambar, any final thoughts? Thanks again to Neta for collabing with us.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having us. No, I think those two pretty much cover it. But I think just for anybody watching, I think these are all just like the start of some very big conversations. And I think even just taking what we've said about bringing these conversations into our homes and our communities too, just thinking about how you're doing that as well is really important.
Awesome. All right. Well, without much further ado, we'll come on to say like a final farewell. But Mr. AJ Rafael,
Yes.
I'm so excited for you to bless us with a performance. So as I mentioned at the top of the slide, AJ is incredibly close to 1 million subscribers on YouTube. Okay, so I'm going to drop the YouTube link again, but if you could just give him a follow, you will not be disappointed by his content. So AJ, could you just set it up for us? Any last words that you might have for us, and let us know what you'll be performing? Yes,
I mean, everything today was really inspiring. I'm gonna watch it again, to be honest. I'm inspired at the end of the day. So thank you for sharing that. And I've just been listening the whole time, and hopefully I can take, little remnants of what y'all have been saying to your specific communities to mine as well. So my last words are just to take care of your mental health. And I have been looking at the election for being a time that I'm going to be able to rest a little bit. But just like Chai said, the work isn't done. It's just for the beginning for a lot of these issues that were raised in the last 4 years, especially. So this song is a song that I wrote 10 years ago, and we named my town halls that we're doing with Phil Amps for Biden after this song. It's called We Could Happen, and the town halls are called We Could Make It Happen, as in we could make Joe Biden president. We can make it happen. Let's go. I'll hold the door. Please come in and just sit here for a while. This is my way of telling you I need you in my life. It's so cold without your touch. I've been dreaming way too much. Can we just turn this into reality? 'Cause I've been thinking about you lately. Maybe you could save me from this crazy world we live in. And I know we could happen, 'cause you know that I've been feeling you. Storms, they will come, but I know that the sun will shine again. He's my friend, and he says that we belong together. And I'll sing a song to break the ice. Just a smile from you would suffice. It's not me being nice, 'cause this is real tonight. 'Cause I've been thinking about you lately. Maybe you could save me from this crazy world we live in. I know we could happen, 'cause you know that I've been feeling you. I know you want me, I've been thinking about you lately, and maybe you could save me from this crazy world we live in. And I know it could happen, 'cause you know that I've been feeling you. I know you want me to. I know you want me to, yeah. Whoa, whoa, oh, oh. Ba 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 da 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 da.
Yay!
Hey, lighters
There you go.
in the air.
Thanks,
everyone.
In the air. So tuning in from the East Coast, the Midwest, the Arizona to California. So thankful for each of y'all being here digitally, doing the work. I am leaving, as AJ said, so inspired by the work of each of you and your tactics and the ways that you've pivoted and made it happen. Thank you so much to everybody that tuned in, raised a solid $800, and we can still raise more. I'm going to be taking donations through the end of the day. So please let folks know that they can still send me money. And I know that every single dollar is going to go towards really, really meaningful outreach to support y'all for doing the work. So thank you so much to Neta Collab and Ambar, to Melissa with Aquí, Vota, to Chai at Freedom Action Now, and AJ for rounding us out with an amazing song.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks,
all right, we'll tune out.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
everyone.
Take care.
Bye.